Hello, welcome back to Book and Page. We are on to Chapter 9 of Remarque's All Quiet on the Western Front. We'll start, of course, with a brief summary of what happened during this chapter, and then get into talking about things in a little more detail. This is another one of those chapters that just shows you the horror of war in a really visceral way. Probably should be assuming that for just this book in general, but as a warning. So Paul has finished his leave and his training, and he's headed back to join 2nd Company. Too terribly bad, he actually can't find them for a little bit, and when he does finally get there, they have just returned from the front. Paul is actually feeling very guilty because while his friends have survived this trip to the front, he was not there, he was on leave. He does share the rest of the cakes his mother made for him, which is very nice. But when they're sent up to the front again, things are going to get a little weird. Too terribly bad, they're not going there right away. There's some rumors that maybe peace talks are happening. Maybe they're being moved to the Russian front. And then they finally figure it out. They're actually being inspected by the Kaiser soon. So everybody's handed out brand new equipment and shiny uniforms. The Kaiser comes through, it's real quick, real boring, and then they have to return all the new stuff and use their rags again. Turns out the good stuff is just for when the Kaiser's here. The group actually discusses this visit a little bit and the moral implications of it, and then they head to the front, where they also talk about mortars literally blowing you out of your clothes. Yes. When they head to the front fully, there are scout parties heading out, and Paul, because he's been on leave and feeling guilty about it, volunteers to head out and scout no man's land. He gets a little ways out and then actually has a panic attack which freezes him in a shell hole. He's unable to move in any direction until he hears the voices of his friends behind him, which finally prompts him to move ahead with the job that he has volunteered to do. Unfortunately, he actually gets lost in no man's land. He's not sure which direction is the French-British line and which direction is the German line. And there have been people who have very cheerfully hopped into the wrong trench thinking it was the right one. So Paul himself finds himself a shell hole to get into because a barrage is starting, followed by a French attack on the German lines. Paul actually plays dead for part of it, and then recognizes he'll have to defend himself if anyone jumps into his particular hole, so he actually pulls out a knife, and when a Frenchman does jump in on top of him, he stabs the man 3 times. It's actually not enough to kill him, and Paul, feeling guilty, tries to help take care of the man and comfort him until he dies about the next day at 3. After that, Paul is still stuck in the hole with this dead man until the night where he can safely crawl back, so he actually goes a little mad and wild in the hole, talking about how he'll write to the man's family to explain, he'll send them money, he'll take care of them, he'll do what he can to make it right. But part of his brain also recognizes he'll never do any of those things. He's just feeling really guilty at the moment. Night falls, and he does safely get back to his own line, though he's smart enough to actually call out so that his own people don't shoot him, and he meets up with Crompt and Kat, who are coming out to find him. And he later admits to the two of them about the Frenchman in the trench. They reassure him and actually calm him down, and Kat specifically points him towards where the snipers are to say to be like the snipers, who were joking, laughing, and not taking the death seriously. It's something that they have to do in war. And yeah, that's the end of our chapter. Whew, it's a wild ride in a lot of ways. There are some big subjects I definitely want to talk about, but there is an interesting little fact that was mentioned here that I also mentioned in the summary that I just want to give a brief explanation for. It's actually mentioned that this Frenchman that Paul stabs dies about 3 o'clock in the afternoon. This is a very interesting time to mention because 3 o'clock is generally the death knell time. It's supposedly the time that Christ expired on the cross, And many places, churches, and later, interestingly enough, German concentration camps during World War II will ring the bell at 3 to represent this moment. So the 3 o'clock moment here is actually a very deep moment if you're aware of that significance. But hey, maybe, again, the curtains are blue because the curtains are blue. I find this chapter really interesting because it pairs up these incongruent moments where we have the inspection by the Kaiser followed by another point where they're on the front. Because usually these moments haven't been mingling in chapters. It's usually been a chapter about the front, chapter about not being at the front, another chapter about not being at the front, chapter at the front. It's less about showing the transition between the two. So the fact that we're seeing it here in the latter part of the novel should be significant. We should be paying attention to the fact that we're seeing these things starting to fuse together and what importance is actually there. And it should be noted that we seem to have a quicker time period here because the company has just gotten back from the front when Paul meets up with them. There's this inspection moment, which, yeah, sure, that could probably take a little longer. And then they're back at the front again. So it doesn't feel like there's as much cool down time for the company. But that might be because Paul has had all of this time. He hasn't gone to the front that first time. So it seems like a quicker switch over for him. And the Kaiser inspection is really interesting, particularly the conversation that the soldiers have after the fact. But there are some interesting things about it, of course, which is we are constantly lying to each other. So the whole time that Paul is on leave, he's telling stories to the people he asks. He's lying to the mothers, especially his own mother and Kemmerich's mother, about how awful things actually are. He's saying that they're perfectly fine, death is swift when it comes, things like that, which are direct lies. But there's a pageantry that's now been brought in when it comes to the state's view of these stories, right? Paul has been a storyteller from the very beginning. That's how he's trying to deal with all of this. But it hasn't been nearly as dressed up that it is in this moment where the Kaiser comes in. And they're quite literally given all new things so that everything looks fine. Look, we're winning the war. Look at our soldiers. They're all nice and well fed and well put together, and we're marching, and there's a parade, and woo! And then the Kaiser disappears, and it's like, give us the stuff back. Like, we can't afford to give that all to you. Give it back to us. Yeah, we're gonna move it to the next group of soldiers that the Kaiser is inspecting over there. Give it back. So, this storytelling that we've been seeing has now been expanded to, like, a state level that now has a lot of pageantry and, look, aren't we beautiful? Young warriors! Ha! But the problem with this is that it's precisely then feeding in to the mistakes that the people, the civilians who aren't on the front, are buying into. Which is like this young warrior fighting for the fatherland ideal. And the fact that then we're dressing up these soldiers and acting like everything's fine. Like we all believe in this still and we're not wrecked men. It's just a story that's snowballing in on itself, that if you're vaguely aware of it, you know it's all artificial. It's all this painted screen of, hey, look, we're doing the right thing. But that's what you have to buy into. Or maybe you don't. Maybe you don't have to buy into this. And that's actually the conversation that follows this inspection, that starts with this weird little power question that we've seen throughout the entire novel. who has all of the power in these situations? Does a king have to salute an emperor? Because, of course, all of the military people have to salute the emperor, the Kaiser. But does, like, a king have to? Like, who is, like, upwards ruling class here? And Kat tells Tijin to, like, that's not important. But it is an interesting question when we've been wondering about this power dynamic the entire time, is who's actually in power here? Because it buys into the major question that spans this entire chapter, which is who could have said no. And I mean that it spans the entire chapter. Because there is this question of buying into the storytelling. There's a question of making the other side seem worse in the storytelling. And in fact, they call those people out in the chapter. Like those who write propaganda that says we eat Belgian babies. They're guilty for all of this. They're just pushing this story so unbelievably far that thousands upon thousands upon thousands of men are dying because of it. But it really does become the question, though, when you think about it, who could have said no? I am actually going to link to the extra history videos on the start of World War I, because it is an extremely interesting bit of history. Because Eric is right, the Kaiser was against this. He did not want this to happen. And in fact, the Russian Tsar at the time is the Kaiser's cousin. And they're writing very personal messages to each other and calling each other, desperately trying to prevent the war. And are desperately actually unable to do it. So when you know the history, and I really advise you to go and watch that because it gives you a sense of just how powerless these very powerful men felt, it becomes a really important question. Who could have stopped all of this from happening? Because Tijin's question about whether a king has to salute an emperor is a really important one if we honestly believe that emperors and czars and kaisers have power. But if they don't have the ability to look at a situation like this and say, no, we're not going to war, what power do they actually have? And Paul recognizes this. Paul actually states, no, the Kaiser was against this. He wanted to say no. But obviously, him saying no is not enough to stop this war. Or could it have been? Could the Kaiser have literally put his foot down and absolutely refused to move? That's the historic question, right? And that's the question these soldiers are asking themselves. And when they recognize that the Kaiser was against it, the next question is, if 20 or 30 men had said no, could we have stopped this? Because they're looking at this power dynamic of countries against each other, mainly about the state, right? So if big men had been willing and able to say no, could we have avoided going to war? Because everybody here, all the soldiers here are saying, I don't feel offended. I don't feel like the French have done anything to me personally. I would have said no. I wouldn't have put myself in this position, obviously. I don't gain anything from this. Well, obviously, emperors and generals gain something from this. So if they had just said no, if they had let go of what they could gain from this war and said no, could we have prevented this war? And that's a really interesting question because you do see how the questions build. If the state had said no, could we have prevented this war? But Kat brings up a really good point, because the state and the fatherland are two very different things. And it is the use of the threat against the fatherland that brings all the soldiers into this. That's the patriotism. Most people aren't patriotic about their government. They are patriotic about their country. In fact, a lot of people can be very, very critical of their government. I spoke this to a colleague of mine when she was attempting to explain loving a country that has done nothing right recently. And I said that I understand that you can love a country and not love how it's run. And that sort of became, like, her eyes lit up when I worded it that way, because that was precisely what she was trying to explain to me. She doesn't love the government. She loves the country. And that's the difference being made here, right? Kat points this out. So, this whole war can't be purely an issue of the state. And if it is, that means the state has enough power and enough propaganda to convince patriots that it's not just the state in trouble or that will benefit, but the country. And this gets really weird then, because they don't ask the next question. They ask, if the Kaiser had said no, could we have stopped this? And the answer seems to be, historically, no. The Kaiser didn't want this, and yet here we are. If 20 or 30 men high up in the government who benefit from war had in fact said no, could we have stopped that? And we don't get a comfortable answer there. We don't get a clear answer. We get the question of the difference between state and fatherland. Because the implied next question then is, if every single one of us had said no, if every single soldier on both sides of the war had said no. And I'm not talking about the officers, I am not talking about the politicians or the leaders of those countries. I am in fact talking about Paul and Kat and Crompt and the Frenchmen that Paul kills and the other French and British men on the other side of the lines. If they had said no, truth be told, none of this would have gone forward, right? And this has sort of been the build-up of a lot of the discussions about human nature and the army this entire novel. Because a lot of the soldiers say, like, war should just be a one-on-one battle or something like that. Because it really is this concept of they don't want to be here. They don't have any personal reason that they're fighting. Yet somehow we are here. And Paul actually comes face to face with this in that shell hole with the wounded Frenchman, where he is talking to this dead body and he says, if we could go back and you jumped in again, I would not have attacked you if you were as civil to me. And it's literally that. It is this discussion of the idea that if you and I could meet face to face and choose to drop our weapons and trust the other person will do the same, then neither of us would have had to die. So who could have said no? Well, the soldiers. But if you look at history, even that's not an easy answer. because there were people who said no. Remarque writes this after World War I, but before World War II. And he escapes to Switzerland and America, like I said in my author discussion with World War II. But his sister loses her life in Germany for speaking up against the Nazis. She said no. She lived through World War I and saw what was happening, and she said no. And the state and the leader killed her for it. How many people want to start saying no, but then are told all that propaganda? They're told they will come into your homes, they will rape your wives and children, and they will kill them. You can't say no in a moment like that. So when you actually look at it historically, that's the issue. No one's willing to say no first. At least not on a grand country scale. The Kaiser wants to say no. But for the sake of his country, he cannot say no until the Russians say no. But the Russians can't say no for the sake of their country until the Germans say no. Paul can't afford to let the Frenchman jump into his hole at the risk that he will die. He has to kill the Frenchman or the Frenchman will kill him. There is no trust between them that says they can both back down and trust the other person to do that. Because they're at war. The issue of this chapter and the absolute wildness that Paul's mind gets into is to realize that they're all human beings who are killing each other, and none of them have a good excuse for it anymore. They've seen the falseness of the propaganda of both their own country and the other countries. But they don't have the ability to say no anymore. Who had the ability to say no is a question that haunts this novel. That's from that man, that schoolboy, the one boy in his class who didn't want to sign up, but was pressured into it. His ability to say no was taken away from him. Maybe there's a strong possibility that everyone in this novel has lost the ability to say no. At least in any meaningful way. But the ability to face down death and say no is actually where a lot of heroes in wartime come from. It is the people who resisted the Nazi regime in Germany. It is the people that helped smuggle Jews out. It's the French resistance. It is the people who sought peace, even when their country was saying, don't. We could push through and end this war by decimating Germany. We are at a terrible moment in this novel where people seem powerless to say no, but it's precisely the action that is necessary to change so much of the outcome. But what does that mean for us? How do we feel about Paul's actions when he recognizes if he had just said no, then another man didn't have to die? But could the Frenchman have also said no, and save Paul's life? Can we blame Paul for the choice that he made? And could we stand up and say no at a critical point in our own history when you were facing down the possibility of death? Can you throw yourself, your body and your life on the line to stop something like this from happening? And if it's already happening, then what is the worth of that self-sacrifice? So many uncomfortable questions. And all of them in this chapter revolving around the word no. I'm going to keep reading, and I hope you do too. See you next time.